Wait, before you scroll away. I need you to hear this one. A billionaire faked his own death just to see who really loved him. His fiancée showed up in a designer gown, dry-eyed, checking her watch. But on her knees in the mud beside his grave was a maid nobody expected to care at all. What she said when she thought no one was listening changed everything he thought he knew about love. Stay with me. This one gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Let me know your country in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Tonight's story is about a man who had everything money could buy, and still didn't know who truly loved him. It's emotional, it's heartbreaking, and it has a twist I promise you won't see coming. So grab something warm, get comfortable, and let's begin. Nobody in Charleston knew Nathaniel Cole's real face. Only his name on buildings. Nathaniel Cole was 38 years old and worth more money than most people could count in a lifetime. He owned hotels along the coast, a shipping company, and a penthouse that looked out over the whole city like a throne. But none of that money had ever bought him the one thing he actually wanted. Someone who loved him for himself, not for his name. 3 months ago, he'd proposed to Vivian Hart, a woman he'd met at a charity gala. She was beautiful, sharp, and always said the right things at the right time. His mother used to say, "Son, be careful of people who never disagree with you. Real love pushes back sometimes." But Nathaniel had been lonely for so long that he mistook agreement for affection. There was one other person in his life he barely noticed. Rosa Delgado, the housekeeper who'd worked for his family since he was a teenager. She was quiet, hard-working, and never asked him for anything. She remembered how he liked his coffee. She noticed when he hadn't slept. She was, in every way that mattered, invisible to him, the way wallpaper is invisible until the day you finally look at it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Nathaniel overheard something that cracked his world open. He was in his study late one night when he heard Vivian on the phone in the hallway, laughing with someone. "Once the wedding's done and the prenup expires in a year, I'll have everything I need," she said. "He's sweet, but honestly, boring. I just need to survive the next 12 months. Nathaniel didn't move. He didn't breathe. He stood there in his own house feeling like a stranger. He could have confronted her right then. But something in him, some old wound from watching his father get used by people too, needed more than a phone call to believe it. He needed proof. Real proof. So he came up with a plan that even his closest friend, his lawyer Marcus, told him was insane. "You want to fake your own death," Marcus said, staring at him across the desk. "Nathaniel, that's not a plan, that's a movie." "I need to see who actually shows up," Nathaniel said quietly. "Not who says the right things. Who shows up when there's nothing left to gain." Marcus tried to talk him out of it for an hour. In the end, he agreed to help, on one condition. "1 month," Marcus said. "Then you come back, whatever you find." They staged a car accident on a rainy coastal road outside the city. The car found burned beyond recognition, dental records confirming the identity, a closed casket at Marcus's insistence. Only 3 people knew the truth: Nathaniel, Marcus, and the private investigator who helped arrange it. Within 48 hours, Nathaniel Cole was dead to the entire world. He watched the news alone in a rented cabin 2 hours outside the city, a baseball cap pulled low, a stranger's face in the mirror. The headlines called him a self-made success story cut short. They mentioned his fiancée, devastated, according to her publicist. He almost laughed. Vivian had a publicist prepared to speak for her grief before his body was even cold. But there was a name in one small local article that stopped him. A quote, almost an afterthought, from a member of the household staff. Rosa Delgado had said only one sentence to the reporter. "He was the kindest man I ever worked for, and I will miss him every single day." Nathaniel read that sentence 4 times. He told himself it meant nothing. Staff say things like that. It's polite. It's expected. But something about it sat differently than anything else he'd read. The funeral was set for that Saturday. And Nathaniel Cole, dead man walking, decided he needed to be there. Hidden, watching, silent, to see with his own eyes who cried for the man, and who cried for the money. He had no idea what he was about to witness would break his heart in one direction, and rebuild it in another he never expected. The rain started the moment the first car arrived at the cemetery. Nathaniel stood 200 feet away, half hidden behind the wide trunk of an old oak tree, wearing a plain gray coat with the collar turned up, sunglasses despite the gray sky, a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. His own funeral. He felt sick just standing there. The cemetery filled slowly with black umbrellas, business partners, distant cousins he barely spoke to, a few employees who genuinely liked him, reporters kept respectfully at a distance by security. And then the town car pulled up, and Vivian stepped out. She wore a stunning navy blue gown, not black. Navy, she'd explained to someone once, was more sophisticated for outdoor events. Her hair was perfectly styled despite the rain, an umbrella held carefully over her head by an assistant so not a single curl got wet. She walked to the front row with her chin high, sunglasses on, dry-eyed. Nathaniel watched her greet people. Not with grief, with composure, like she was hosting the event rather than mourning at it. At one point she checked her phone. At another point, she leaned toward a cousin and whispered something that made the woman stifle a small laugh, quickly hidden behind a gloved hand. His chest ached, but not with surprise. He'd expected this. He'd overheard the phone call. He knew what she was. And yet some small, stubborn part of him had hoped he was wrong. Then he saw Rosa. She arrived late on foot, having taken 2 buses because she didn't own a car. She wore her only good dress, a simple pale pink one, no umbrella. Her hair already soaked through by the time she reached the grave. She didn't stand with the important people near the casket. She stood at the very back, alone, hands folded, shoulders shaking. When the priest finished the final words and the small crowd began to disperse toward their cars, quickly, eager to escape the rain, Rosa didn't move. She waited until almost everyone was gone. Then she walked slowly to the graveside, and she knelt down in the mud in her only good dress, not caring at all, and she pressed her palm flat against the wet earth like she was trying to reach him through it. Nathaniel couldn't hear her at first. He crept closer, staying behind the tree line. His heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. "You were the only person who ever asked about my daughter," Rosa said through her tears, her voice breaking on every other word. "You paid for her braces and told me not to tell anyone. You remembered my mother was sick and sent flowers with no card, but I knew it was you because nobody else knew her name. You didn't have to be kind to me. You had every reason not to notice me at all. And you noticed everything." Nathaniel's knees nearly gave out behind that tree. He hadn't told a single soul about the braces, about the flowers. He'd done those things quietly, deliberately, wanting nothing back, not even acknowledgement. He'd assumed she never even connected the dots. He'd been wrong. She'd known all along, and she'd carried that gratitude silently for years, never once mentioning it, never once asking for anything more. 50 feet away, near the cars, Vivian's laughter carried faintly on the wind as she chatted with a cousin about a restaurant reservation for later that evening. Nathaniel stood frozen between the 2 women, one who had never asked him for a single thing and was breaking apart in the mud over his death, and one who was already planning her dinner. He had wanted proof. Now he had it. But it wasn't the proof he expected, and it landed somewhere far deeper than he was prepared for. He almost stepped out from behind that tree. He almost called her name. Rosa was still on her knees when a black town car glided up the cemetery road. Not Vivian's, a different one. A man stepped out, mid-40s, expensive suit, an umbrella held by no one but himself. Nathaniel recognized him instantly. Preston Cole, his own cousin. The man who'd run the shipping division for the last 6 years and had never once, in all that time, hidden his resentment that Nathaniel, younger, sharper, luckier, as Preston always said, had inherited the controlling shares their grandfather left behind. Preston didn't go to the grave. He went straight to Vivian. Nathaniel watched them speak, heads close together under her assistant's umbrella, and something in the ease between them made his stomach turn cold. They weren't strangers offering each other condolences. They stood like people who already knew each other's rhythms. He crept closer along the tree line, close enough now to catch fragments carried on the wind. "The board meets Thursday," Preston was saying. "Once probate clears, my shares plus yours from the settlement puts us past 40% combined. Marcus can stall the will reading, but not forever." "He wanted everything to go through slowly," Vivian answered, voice low, businesslike, nothing like the grieving fiancé act she'd worn for the cameras minutes earlier. "Fine. Slow is fine. I've been patient for 3 months. I can be patient a little longer." Nathaniel felt the ground tilt under him. This wasn't just a fiancé who didn't love him. This was 2 people who had been circling his company, and possibly his life, long before that car ever went off the coastal road. The affair, if that's what it was, hardly mattered anymore next to the chill that ran through him at the word settlement. What settlement? He hadn't settled anything with Vivian. Unless she meant something that hadn't happened yet. He thought of the accident. The private investigator who'd helped stage it. A man Marcus had vetted, supposedly, through a trusted contact. A trusted contact Preston had once recommended 2 years earlier, for a security matter at the shipping yard. Nathaniel's blood went cold in the rain. Had this only ever been his plan? Or had someone already been planning something like it? Something real, and his fake death had simply walked, uninvited, into the middle of someone else's actual scheme? He didn't have time to think it through. Preston glanced up, scanning the tree line out of old habit, the way men who are hiding something always seem to check their surroundings, and for one terrible half-second, his eyes swept directly over the oak tree where Nathaniel stood. Nathaniel didn't breathe, didn't blink. The rain poured down between them like a curtain, and after a long, unbearable moment, Preston's gaze moved on, unconvinced there'd been anything there at all. Nathaniel stepped back deeper into the trees, hands shaking, his mind a storm. Somewhere behind him, faint over the sound of rain hitting leaves, he could still hear Rosa quietly crying at his grave, whispering a promise to visit every Sunday. 2 women. One grieving a man who was never real to lose. One planning with his own cousin what might come next. He had come here for the truth. He hadn't expected the truth to have teeth. Marcus's cabin office smelled like coffee and old paper, and Nathaniel paced the length of it 4 times before he could even speak. "Say that again," Marcus said, setting down his pen. Preston recommended Delgado. No, not Delgado, the investigator. The one who arranged the crash scene, the dental records, all of it. Preston recommended him 2 years ago for the security contract at the shipyard. Marcus went very still. That doesn't mean anything by itself. And Vivian used the word settlement. Not wedding. Not marriage. Settlement. Like something had already been finalized, or was about to be. Nathaniel dropped into the chair across from him, rubbing both hands over his face. "Marcus, what if this wasn't just me testing her? What if I handed 2 people who wanted me gone the perfect cover story?" Marcus was already reaching for his laptop, fingers moving fast. "I'm calling in a favor. Financial records, phone records, whatever I can pull quietly without tipping anyone off that you're alive." He paused, looking up. "You understand if this is what you think it is, we're not talking about a broken engagement anymore. We're talking about attempted." "I know what we're talking about," Nathaniel said quietly. Took 3 days. 3 days of Nathaniel sitting in that cabin, unable to sleep, replaying Rosa's voice at the grave over and over. "You noticed everything. like it was the only steady thing left in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. On the third night, Marcus arrived with a folder and a face Nathaniel had never seen on his old friend before. Grim, careful, the face of a man about to say something he wished he didn't have to. "The investigator who arranged your accident," Marcus said, "had a second job lined up 2 weeks before you came to me. Real one. Same client. Preston Cole, through a shell company. He was hired to arrange a genuine accident on that same stretch of road, timed for right after the wedding, once Vivian's position in the will was fully secured as your spouse. When you came to me wanting to fake your death, we unknowingly used the same man already circling you for something far worse. He took your money to stage a fake crash, fully intending to still collect from Preston for a real one later, once you were officially remarried and your estate was locked into her name." Nathaniel sat with that for a long moment, the rain outside ticking softly against the cabin windows, the same rain that had soaked Rosa to the skin at his grave 3 days earlier. "So the plan was never really about love," he said slowly. "It was never really even about the affair. Vivian was going to marry me, wait out the settlement clause, and somewhere down the line, Preston was going to make sure I never got old." "That's what the records suggest," Marcus said. "I want to be careful. We have enough to bring in the authorities, but we need it airtight. Which means you stay dead a little longer." Nathaniel almost laughed, a broken, hollow sound. He'd faked his death to find out if anyone truly loved him. Instead, he'd stumbled backward into discovering someone had been planning to make his death real all along, and the only person on that entire cemetery lawn who had cried for him, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by caring, was a woman who cleaned his floors and remembered his coffee order. "There's someone else who needs protecting in all this," Nathaniel said suddenly, sitting up straighter. "Rosa. If Preston or Vivian ever suspects she knows anything, or even just that she was close to me." "She's not a target," Marcus said gently. "She's staff. They have no reason to think about her at all." "That's exactly the problem," Nathaniel said. "Nobody ever thinks about her. I never did either. Not until she was the only real thing at my own funeral." Rosa Delgado's small rented house sat 3 streets back from the coal estate, close enough that she could walk to work, far enough that she never confused the two worlds. 2 weeks after the funeral, she still hadn't gone back to work. There was no work to go back to, not with the house locked up under a court seal while the estate was settled. She picked up shifts cleaning offices downtown instead, coming home each night to the small kitchen table where her 12-year-old daughter, Maya, waited with homework and questions Rosa didn't always have answers for. "Mama, are you sad about Mr. Cole again?" Rosa would nod, and Maya, wise beyond her years the way children of hard-working single mothers often are, would simply sit closer to her on the couch without saying anything else. Some griefs don't need words. They just need company. What Rosa didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 3 streets away, in a cabin 2 hours out of the city, the man she was grieving was very much alive, and thinking about her more than he'd thought about anyone in years. Nathaniel had asked Marcus, carefully, cautiously, to have someone quietly check in on her. Not to reveal anything. Just to make sure she was safe, that the bills were being handled, that whatever debt of gratitude he owed her wasn't going unpaid simply because he was pretending to be dead. What came back surprised him more than he expected. Rosa hadn't just been the housekeeper who noticed his coffee order. 8 years earlier, before she'd even started working for his family, she'd been a nurse's aide at the hospital where his mother spent her final 6 weeks. Nathaniel had been 28 then, exhausted, grieving in advance, barely holding together the pieces of his life while running a company that refused to slow down for anyone's mourning. Rosa had been the aide on the night shift most nights that final month. She was the one who'd found him asleep in the hallway chair at 3 a.m. more than once, and gently woken him to tell him his mother was calling for him. She was the one who'd brought him coffee without being asked and never once mentioned that she recognized the exhausted, grieving young billionaire wasn't so different from any other exhausted, grieving son she'd cared for in that hospital. When his mother passed and the family began hiring new household staff a year later, Rosa had applied. Not because she recognized the family name and saw an opportunity, Marcus's investigator confirmed, but because a friend at the hospital mentioned the position, and Rosa needed steady work close to home for Maya's sake. She never once mentioned to Nathaniel that she'd been there in those final weeks. She let him hire her fresh, a stranger, because she understood, better than almost anyone, that grief doesn't need an audience, and some kindnesses are better left unspoken. Nathaniel read the report 3 times in the cabin, hands trembling. He hadn't just lost track of a good employee. He had spent 8 years standing next to someone who had already quietly, privately witnessed him at his very lowest, and had never once used it, never once mentioned it, never once asked for anything in return except the simple decency of being treated fairly, which he had, without even realizing what he owed her. "I need to see her," he told Marcus that night. "You can't," Marcus said immediately. "Not yet. Not until Preston and the investigator are contained. The moment anyone sees you alive, this whole operation collapses, and everyone connected to you becomes a target, including her." Nathaniel knew he was right. But knowing it didn't make it easier to sit in that cabin one more night, thinking about a woman on her knees in the mud, promising to visit a grave every Sunday, for a man who was very much alive and utterly unworthy, in that moment, of everything she'd given him without ever asking to be seen. Vivian Hart had never liked waiting, and the weeks after the funeral were testing every ounce of patience she had. The will reading kept getting delayed, first for administrative reasons, then because Marcus, as executor, cited an ongoing audit of the estate that state law required before distribution. She sat across from him in his office for the 3rd time in a month, her smile tightening with each passing week. "Marcus, I understand procedure, but I am his fiancée. I have a wedding dress I never got to wear and a life I need to rebuild. Surely there's something you can expedite." "The law doesn't move faster for grief, Ms. Hart," Marcus said evenly. "I wish it did." What Vivian didn't know was that Marcus was watching her more closely than he'd ever watched anyone in his career, and every delay was buying time for investigators to trace the financial trail connecting her, Preston, and the man who'd arranged Nathaniel's staged death. Preston, for his part, was growing careless. Confidence does that to people who've never been caught before. He began attending board meetings with a new sharpness, subtly steering votes, quietly courting shareholders who'd been loyal to Nathaniel for years. He assumed, wrongly, that a dead man's company was simply there for the taking by whoever moved fastest and smiled widest. 2 towns over, in the rented cabin, Nathaniel spent his days going through financial records Marcus smuggled to him, and his nights doing something he hadn't done in years, actually thinking about what kind of life he wanted, instead of what kind of empire he was supposed to be building. He thought about his father, who'd worked himself into an early grave chasing a fortune he barely had time to enjoy. He thought about his mother's final weeks, and the quiet nurse's aide who'd never once made his grief about anything but him. He thought about Vivian's laughter carrying on the cemetery wind while she discussed dinner reservations feet from his own grave. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand something he'd never let himself understand before. He had spent his whole adult life mistaking attention for love, and had walked right past the real thing more than once because it never announced itself, never performed, never needed an audience to prove it was there. One evening, Marcus arrived at the cabin with news that made Nathaniel stand up so fast he knocked his chair backward. "We have it," Marcus said. "Wire transfers between a shell company tied to Preston and the investigator's firm, dated 2 weeks before you came to me. Emails referencing the 2nd phase after the wedding. And a voice recording. The investigator, apparently nervous about being left holding all the risk, recorded a call with Preston as insurance. He handed it to us this afternoon in exchange for a plea deal." He just handed it over. Turns out loyalty has a price, and Preston stopped paying it on time, Marcus said grimly. The recording is enough. Combined with the financial trail, the district attorney is ready to move. But Nathaniel, the moment we act, you have to come back. Publicly. There's no more staying hidden after this breaks. Nathaniel stood at the cabin window, looking out at the dark tree line, and thought of only one thing. Before any of that happens, he said quietly, I need 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes with Rosa, before the whole world finds out I'm alive from a headline instead of from me. Marcus studied his old friend for a long moment, then finally nodded. Sunday, he said. She visits the grave every Sunday like she promised. If you're going to do this, that's where it has to happen. Sunday came gray and quiet, the kind of overcast morning that felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. Rosa arrived at the cemetery at 10, just as she had every week since the funeral, carrying a small bundle of wildflowers from the lot behind her house because real flower shop bouquets weren't in her budget, not with Maya's school shoes needing replacing and the electric bill higher than usual. She knelt at the grave the way she always did, laid the flowers gently against the headstone, and began speaking quietly, the way she did every Sunday, telling him about her week, about Maya's science project, about nothing important at all, just the small, ordinary details of a life she thought he could no longer hear. She didn't notice the man approaching from the tree line until his shadow fell across the headstone. She looked up, startled, ready to apologize for intruding on whoever else might be visiting a nearby grave, and the flowers slipped straight out of her hands. For a long, frozen moment, Rosa simply stared, certain her mind had finally cracked from months of grief and exhaustion, certain this was some cruel trick of the overcast light. It's really me, Nathaniel said softly, crouching down to her level, the way you'd approach someone you were afraid might bolt or faint or both. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Rosa. I need you to let me explain before you say anything. She didn't scream. She didn't cry, not at first. She simply sat back on her heels in the wet grass and stared at him like she was memorizing his face all over again, checking it against the version she'd built entirely out of memory and grief for weeks. You're supposed to be dead, she finally whispered. I know. I buried flowers on your grave every single Sunday. I know. I watched the first one. I was standing right there behind that tree the whole time. His voice cracked slightly. I heard everything you said. Something shifted in her face, confusion sliding slowly into a different kind of hurt, sharper than grief. You were alive. This whole time you let me believe. She stopped, pressing a hand over her mouth, and when she spoke again her voice had an edge Nathaniel had never heard from her in 8 years. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To Maya. She asked me every day if you were in a better place now. Told her yes. I told my daughter a lie because I believed it myself. I never meant for you to be part of it, Nathaniel said, and the honesty in his voice was raw enough that Rosa's anger faltered, just slightly. I did something reckless. I wanted to know if the woman I was about to marry actually loved me, or just loved what I could give her. I never once imagined the person who'd end up breaking apart at my grave would be you. I thought, if I even thought about you at all going into this, I thought you'd be sad the way you'd be sad for any decent boss. I had no idea what you actually carried for me. What you've carried quietly, since before you even worked for my family. Rosa went very still. You know about the hospital. I know everything, he said gently. I know you sat with my mother's chart every night that final month. I know you woke me up in that hallway chair more times than I probably remember, because I was too exhausted to remember most of that time at all. I know you never once told me in 8 years that you already knew exactly who I was underneath everything. A scared, grieving son, long before I was ever a name on a building. You never asked for anything. Not even acknowledgement. I don't think I've ever met anyone in my entire life who gave that much and expected that little in return. Rosa's eyes filled, and this time when the tears came, they came from somewhere different than grief. Something more complicated, something that had anger and relief and hurt and disbelief all tangled together at once. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Why come back at all? Why not just let the world believe what it already believes, and start over somewhere clean?" Nathaniel took a breath, the answer already sitting fully formed in his chest, truer than anything he'd said in years. "Because at my own funeral, in the pouring rain, you were the only person who cried for the man instead of the money. And I've spent every day since realizing I don't want to go back to a life where I almost missed that completely." The truth broke publicly 9 days later, and it broke exactly the way Marcus had warned it would. Fast, loud, and impossible to control once it started. The district attorney's office announced arrests in what local news outlets quickly dubbed the Cole conspiracy. Preston Cole taken into custody at his downtown office in front of stunned co-workers, the investigator already cooperating from a plea deal, and Vivian Hart, questioned for hours regarding what prosecutors called foreknowledge of a plot to defraud and endanger her own fiancé, though the financial trail connecting her directly to the more serious charges remained, for now, frustratingly thin. She had known about the money. She may not have known specifically about the plan for a second real accident. It was a distinction her lawyer clung to with everything he had. And then, less than an hour after the first arrest hit the news, Nathaniel Cole walked into a press conference alive. The room went silent, then erupted. Cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters shouted questions over each other so fast the words blurred together. Nathaniel stood at the podium, Marcus beside him, and said only what needed to be said. That he had staged his death after uncovering evidence of a threat to his life, that authorities had been informed and involved from the earliest stage possible, that a genuine criminal conspiracy had, in fact, been in motion against him, separate from his own staged plan, and that he was grateful to be alive to see justice move forward. He did not mention Rosa's name once. He'd promised her that, in the quiet of that Sunday morning at the cemetery, that whatever came next, she would never be dragged into headlines or turned into a story for strangers to pick apart. That part of his life, he told her, was going to stay his, and only shared with the people he chose. But someone had already noticed her. A local reporter, digging through old funeral footage for a follow-up piece, found the moment. Rosa on her knees in the rain, the only person at that funeral who hadn't performed her grief for an audience. The clip started circulating online within days. Captioned things like "the real mourner" and "this woman loved him more than his own fiancé did." It wasn't the exposure Nathaniel wanted for her, but it was at least kind in its framing. Strangers online, moved by the same rawness that had stopped Nathaniel behind that tree weeks earlier. Rosa hated the attention. She stopped checking her phone after the fifth reporter called asking for an interview. Maya, 12 and far more comfortable with the internet than her mother, showed her the comments anyway. Hundreds of strangers writing things like "this is what real love looks like and she deserves the world." "Mama," Maya said one evening, scrolling through them at the kitchen table. "Do you love him? For real, I mean. Not just because he was nice to us." Rosa didn't answer right away. She thought about 8 years of quiet mornings, of coffee made just right without being asked, of a man who noticed things nobody else bothered to notice, and of a version of him she'd glimpsed only once, kneeling exhausted in a hospital hallway, that she'd never told a soul about until the day he stood alive in front of her at his own grave. "I don't know what to call it yet," she finally said honestly. "But I know it's the realest thing I've felt in a long time." 2 miles away, in a penthouse he hadn't set foot in for over a month, Nathaniel Cole stood at the window overlooking the city that had once defined his entire worth, and thought about nothing but a small rented house 3 streets from his old estate, wondering if he had any right at all to walk back into her life and ask for a place in it. He almost didn't go. He stood outside Rosa's small house for nearly 10 minutes before he worked up the nerve to knock, a bouquet of real flowers in his hand this time. Not wildflowers from a vacant lot, but not anything extravagant either, because some part of him understood finally that extravagance had never been the language Rosa spoke or needed. Maya answered the door first, eyes going wide. "You're the dead guy," she said, with the blunt honesty only a 12-year-old could manage. "I was," Nathaniel said, crouching slightly to her height. "I'm working very hard on being the alive guy instead." Rosa appeared behind her daughter, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. And for a moment the three of them just stood there in the doorway, the weight of everything unsaid pressing into the small space between them. "Can I come in?" Nathaniel asked. "Just to talk. I won't stay long if you don't want me to." She stepped aside and let him in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where Rosa had told her daughter comforting lies about a better place, the same table where Maya had shown her mother a screen full of strangers insisting she deserved something more than a life of quiet, unnoticed kindness. "I've spent the last few weeks thinking about something my mother used to say," Nathaniel began, turning the small bouquet over in his hands, suddenly nervous in a way board meetings and hostile takeovers never made him. "She used to say the people who love you loudest aren't always the ones who love you best. I never understood that until I watched two very different women stand near my grave. One of them performed grief perfectly and felt nothing. The other one nearly broke apart trying to hide how much she felt, because she never once thought her feelings were something she had the right to show." Rosa's eyes glistened, but she stayed quiet, letting him finish. "I don't expect anything from you, Rosa. Mean that. You've spent 8 years giving to my family without ever asking for anything back. And I am not here to add myself to that list of things you quietly carry without complaint. I'm here because for the first time in my life, I want to be the one who shows up, who notices, who gives back instead of just receiving. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. But I know I don't want to figure it out anywhere that doesn't include you and Maya, if you'll let me." Maya, listening from the hallway where she'd retreated but clearly hadn't left, poked her head back around the corner. "Is this the part where you kiss or something? Because I have homework and I really don't want to watch that." Despite everything, the grief, the fear, the months of secrets, Rosa laughed, a real, full laugh that seemed to surprise even her. And for the first time since the funeral, the tension in the small kitchen broke apart into something lighter. "Go finish your homework," Rosa told her daughter, still smiling, wiping at her eyes. When Maya finally disappeared down the hallway, Rosa turned back to Nathaniel, her expression serious again, but softer than before. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I never wanted anything from you. Not before, not now. If this is real, it has to be because you actually want it, not because you feel like you owe me something for crying at a grave you weren't even in." "I know," Nathaniel said quietly. "That's exactly why it's real." 6 months later, the courtroom finally closed the last chapter of the Cole conspiracy. Preston Cole was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder and financial fraud. His carelessness and greed laid bare across weeks of testimony that made national news. Vivian Hart avoided the most serious charges, the evidence against her limited to knowledge rather than direct participation, but her reputation collapsed entirely. The woman once photographed at every glittering gala in the city quietly left Charleston within the year, unable to walk into a restaurant without hearing whispers follow her. Nathaniel Cole rebuilt his company from the ground up, this time with a board stripped of anyone who'd ever prioritized profit over people, and a culture, he insisted, that valued the quiet, hard-working people who kept everything running, the assistants, the drivers, the housekeepers, as much as the executives whose names ended up on the building. He never went back to the old penthouse. He and Rosa found a smaller house together instead, modest by his old standards but larger than anything Rosa had ever imagined for herself and Maya. A home with a proper backyard for a dog Maya had wanted for years, close enough to her school that she never had to change friends, close enough to Rosa's family that Sunday dinners became a tradition none of them ever wanted to miss. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Rosa had knelt in the rain at a grave that held nothing but an empty casket, Nathaniel took her back to that same cemetery. Not to grieve this time, but to finally close that chapter properly. Marcus had arranged, quietly and legally, for the headstone to be removed once the estate matters fully settled. In its place, at Nathaniel's request, the cemetery had planted a small flowering tree, the kind that bloomed bright pink every spring. "I wanted something there that meant life instead of death," Nathaniel told her, standing beside the young tree with her hand in his. "Something that would remind anyone who walked by that, even in the worst, strangest chapter of my life. Something good grew out of it." Rosa looked at the tree, then at him, then thought about everything that had led them here. The hospital hallway 8 years ago, the quiet years of unspoken kindness neither of them had ever named, the funeral in the pouring rain, and the 12-year-old daughter waiting for them at home who now called Nathaniel by his first name instead of the dead guy. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think love had to be loud to be real. Grand gestures. Big proposals. I grew up watching movies where love always announced itself with fireworks. But the realest love I've ever known was quiet. It was someone remembering how I take my coffee. It was someone paying attention when nobody else bothered to. It took me 34 years to understand that the loudest people in the room are rarely the ones who love you best." Nathaniel pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "I spent my whole life surrounded by people telling me exactly what I wanted to hear," he said. "It took losing everything, even my own name for a while, to finally notice the one person who never needed to perform anything at all. And if there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you tonight, it's this: pay attention to the people who show up quietly, the ones who remember the small things, the ones who never ask for anything and give everything anyway. Sometimes the people who love us best are standing right beside us the whole time, waiting patiently to finally be seen." If this story touched your heart tonight, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that real love is often the quietest voice in the room. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I'll see you in the next story.